Emily Dickinson is one of the last people that one would expect to become a great poet. She was odd, especially as she grew older. She lived in a big house built by her father. Here are a couple of pictures of it. As you can tell, this was a wealthy family. Emily Dickinson never married, seldom went out in public, and by the time she was middle-aged, she never went out in public. So there are very few images of her, whether photographs or drawings. This is one, however. This was taken when she was a fairly young woman. She died in 1886, and only 7 poems, I think, were published during her lifetime. And those were significantly changed by editors, which soured Emily Dickinson on publication. It wasn't until after she died, when her younger sister was cleaning out her things, that a wealth of poems were found. No one had any idea that she wrote as much as she did. 4 years later, in 1890, the first edition of her selected poems was published. Here's a picture of that volume, but again, it was heavily edited. The poems were not presented as she wrote them because they were misunderstood. The editors just assumed that she wasn't very good at rhyming or rhythm, so they cleaned up her poems and made them prettier. It wasn't until 2 or 3 decades into the 20th century that people started looking at these poems and realizing that Emily Dickinson was a trailblazer when it came to poetic style and content. She was trying to do things with poetry that no one had ever done before. So, what was she trying to do? She was trying to capture big truths in little bitty poems. The other great poet of the late 19th century was Walt Whitman. He was also trying to capture big truths, but Whitman tried to capture big truths in big poems. Whitman's poems are big poems with long lines and panoramic subject matter. I'm not sure this is a good analogy, but Walt Whitman is like a scientist who tries to discover truth by focusing on the solar system and the galaxy. Emily Dickinson is like the scientist who tries to discover truth by looking at an atom. Both are after truth, but one paints on a big canvas and the other on a small canvas. One other thing that Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman had in common is they both tried and succeeded in changing poetic conventions. American poetry in the middle 19th century was dominated by poets who wrote pretty things. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, William Cullen Bryant, and poets like that. They were excellent at rhyme, and they wrote in beautifully regular rhythms. Both Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman felt that such predictable polish took spontaneity and surprise out of poetry. So sometimes Emily Dickinson's lines rhyme perfectly, and sometimes they just don't quite. Not because she couldn't rhyme, but sometimes she wanted a different effect. Same thing with her rhythms. It wasn't until 1955 that the first complete edition of Emily Dickinson's poems was published without any editorial changes. And gradually people interested in poetry have come to realize that Emily Dickinson is a major American poet, but it's taken a long time. And we'll look at a few of her poems and see what we can make of them.